I wanted to tell you a little bit about my story. So I come from, I came to visualization from the design field and design perspective, and I went to school in Baltimore, where I live now. I'm that little red dot up there. And yeah, I came to visualization kind of gradually through school, and I ended up doing it as my thesis project, which is how the y-axis got started. But along the way, I think, it just kind of dawned on me from a design perspective that this was something, really good to get into, really interesting. And, to be honest, Nick Felton might have had something to do with why I started, going into this field. I think his pieces are really interesting. There was an example earlier that sort of looked like some of his pieces where there was a lot of numbers and text. But I actually think that, that his pieces do a good job of telling, his story specifically. And they use, a very limited palette to do it, essentially almost only just the data itself. And of course, a little bit of visualization, but, there's no real annotation, but you still get a sense of his life, of his story. And in some ways, it actually reminds me of the work of Chris Ware on the right there. They work with different mediums, but they're both sort of doing more with less. And they're both in Chris Ware's case, he's using pretty much only images to get across his narrative, almost no text or sort of annotation. But to me, they're kind of similar and they're kind of related. But that might be a little bit of a sidetrack. That's sort of the critic in me coming out, and that's one of my titles nowadays. I'm a critic essentially on the y-axis, and I think in some ways the word critic has sort of a bad taste to it, and that's something that I want to change on the y-axis. And it's not always easy to do. This is the slide for that, the y-axis symbol. But it's not always easy to do because I think someone coming into the field could look at critique and look at the critical analysis that I do and feel a little bit intimidated or sort of feel this certain level of needing to have things polished or needing to have things sort of wrapped up and sort of really solid before they put anything out. And that's something I've heard a couple times from Stephanie Pusovec. She includes in her talk sort of an anecdote about how she's new to visualization, she's just sort of starting out, and she has this sense of sort of intimidation about the field and sort of its history and in general. But that's really not something I want to sort of encourage with the y-axis. And I think she has a point. It sort of is a polarized field. There's a sense of right and wrong in data visualization, I think, and there's definitely ways to make simple mistakes. It happens a lot, I think. And some people find it really useful to point this out and sort of try and learn from mistakes that other people make. But it also does contribute to this, maybe outside perception to some extent that it's very sort of pedantic and there's this black and white that we need to do for the field. But I think there's also an element of maybe intimidation coming from the fact that there's such a long history of data visualization. You have to sort of be up on your visual literacy in some senses, paired with the fact that the field is moving so quickly that you sort of have to keep up with everything that's changing almost on a daily basis. I mentioned sort of this polarization. I think there's, we've been looking at a couple different people's scales. There's all these different scales out there, sides of the spectrum to be on, whether it's form versus function, art versus science, or sort of, explanatory, exploratory, or entertaining graphics. So people, who are talking about this tend to be on either extreme to sort of argue their point, as is healthy, I think, for a field, in the place where data visualization is now. Not by any means a new field, but a very active one at this point. And there's another element where some of the most opinionated people are also the loudest. These gesticulating fellows, they have a lot of influence and they have a lot of things to say about data visualization. It becomes, it's useful to sort of be there to push the field forward, but at the same time, there's sort of ramifications to that. So what I've tried to do on the y-axis is, and here's sort of example of in another field, this is for branding design and graphic design, people taking visualizations and things at face value and sort of, it's a visual product that you're looking at, so it's very easy to sort of, make judgments on the surface level. And then here's an example from the branding world where University of California rebranded. This blog picks up, these rebranding projects and writes a little bit about them, critiques them. But more often than not, the commenters are much more, much harsher on the actual logos than, anything the critiquer would, sort of put out there. And they're, reacting purely on the surface level. So I think there's some data to support, Stephanie's concern where, there's a tweet here, a comment here, a post there that, that really reacts to visualizations somewhat superficially, I think. So, I mean, part of what I'm trying to develop, and something that I think we should always keep in mind is that the finished piece kind of distracts us from deeper levels of investigation. This is a quote from a book called The Shape of Design by Frank Chimero. And he writes very broadly about design, but he also talks about sort of getting in deeper and sort of diving into deeper levels of it and try and understand it more, make it useful for more people essentially. So that's what I'm trying to do on my side, is trying to make it useful for me. I think it's useful for me always to critique pieces and look, try and get behind the scenes, understand people's thinking behind the projects that they work on. Hopefully it's also useful for whoever designed it to get sort of a third-party take on what they've come out with, somebody from the outside looking in. And obviously there's also the audience there, who we're trying to help and trying to benefit by giving them some insight into the process of making a visualization, and hopefully they can use the sort of lessons that get teased out in their own practice. But there's sort of a problem with this approach, and even though we try and take a bit more time, and I try and take a bit more time to look at these and examine these more closely. Really what I'm doing when I'm sitting there and looking at a visualization, kind of peeling it apart, in some ways I'm trying to be a psychic. I'm trying to tap into the mind of the designer and try and guess at what their decision-making process was, why they chose this design, why they chose this form. And it's a real challenge, I think, for us and for anyone who is, a critic. And I think, to some degree, everyone's a critic, to try and get past this, surface level, or even past this sort of, trying to be a psychic about visualization. So what I think we should do is move past being, being psychics into being sort of investigators. Why create this visualization? I think that's sort of the most basic question you can ask about a piece before you're going to sort of judge it or critique it or look at it more closely. So I think that's where we start, is by asking, using the internet, using the power that we have to connect with people, to really, try and understand their visualizations and their work on a deeper level. So that's something I'm trying to do, and I think it's something that everyone should try and do. You can do it on a one-off basis. The most basic way to do it is to ask, why this data was visualized, essentially. And you can get deeper from there. You can start to ask, why did you choose this form to visualize this data? And I think each time you ask why, you get a deeper level of understanding yourself. A lot of times the designer, in the process of explaining it, will understand the visualization better, or at least sort of be able to communicate it in a different way. And each time you ask why, I think you also open it up to a larger audience to get use out of this sort of questioning. Each time you ask why, you reveal something deeper that applies to more fields. So kind of blurring the edges of visualization a little bit by sort of doing this questioning and diving a bit deeper. Once you know the objective of a visualization, that's really when you can sort of be able to say whether it succeeded or failed in that respect. So, like I said, reach out to people in the data visualization community, ask them why, ask them about their visualizations, and sort of create an environment where critique is useful to you and also useful to the designer, and sort of create the sense that we can all sort of get in touch and we can all understand the thought processes behind these pieces that we're constantly churning out. So that's from the critic side, from the individual, from the viewer. But I think for the designers themselves, it would be amazing for you to write a post-mortem essentially after the project is finished, almost like a making of that. If no one asks you, essentially you're going to tell people about your thought process, and in the process of writing about your visualization, you're going to sort of learn something about it, and you'll become, I think, a better designer. I think being able to write about your pieces and write critically about them can only help and sort of only make your thought process and your decision making more visible and sort of more tangible to anyone who looks at it, but also to yourself. I use this sort of tool a lot, and it helps you sort of get back into the groove if you've taken a break, realign your mind sort of to the goals that you have. If they're sort of black and white on paper, I think it can be very helpful. But sort of on a broader sense, what I'm trying to say about critique and about data visualization is that sort of the most effective way to write a critique or to understand a visualization is to actually tell the story of that visualization, almost like a meta story of that visualization, no matter what the type is. If you can understand and find out what the background story is, who's the team, what are the contexts around this visualization that it was created, what's the time constraints, things like that. That you might put into an investigative journalism piece about a specific topic. If you do that about the data visualization, I think you can come to a much deeper understanding of it yourself, for the designer, for the audience, and hopefully make it much more useful as an idea. So that's what I have to say. Thank you.